did get the grades in on time, so they are there for you in eagle lengths. Remember, again, they're just based on about 25% of the semester's work. As I said, they are wrongly named a midterm grade because 25% is not 50%, right? As a real midterm grade should have. So there are plenty of opportunities to improve, and again, I am going to be in the office. I have to probably leave early today, at any rate this, but if you want to discuss how things have gone so far and what you can do better, I am in the office usually from 12 to 12:30 or 1, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Never Tuesday and Thursday. I'm at Essex on Tuesday and Thursday, CCBC Essex. Okay. Well, we saw that Descartes, in this project of methodic doubt, does not want to end up in skepticism, but he's looking for foundations for knowledge. And what he's looking for is an axiom or some axioms that he can build his whole system on. In other words, he's looking for at least one statement that is absolutely true and beyond doubt. But the way he goes about looking for this, as we saw last time, folks, if you're using your phones for something in class, fine. If you're not, I'd ask you to put them away, type your texting. I don't like seeing people with them out if they're not doing something for class. But at any rate, we saw that the way he did it was by raising these hyperbolic doubts, these unusual doubts. In other words, the way he is going about trying to find a statement that's so true it cannot be doubted, it's beyond doubt, is to doubt other beliefs and statements that he thinks are true, to see if there are any about which he cannot raise a doubt. Now, we saw that there's a whole class that he was going to raise doubts about, whole classes of beliefs. He'd never finish if he was going to raise doubts about individual beliefs. So we saw that he raises a doubt about all of the knowledge we have and all of the beliefs we have that come at us from our five senses. And he does this with the dream conjecture, by conjecturing that maybe the beliefs I have about living in a real world with real people, maybe I can raise a doubt about those because I might be dreaming all this up. Now, whether or not you think, whether or not you want to agree with Descartes that we can never for sure distinguish between dreaming and waking, such that we could say for sure that we're not dreaming now, we're awake, Descartes thinks that we cannot distinguish between dreaming and waking, and so he can raise a doubt about all the knowledge his senses give us, and this extends to knowledge from the observational sciences. Now, I'm just, reviewing what we've done up to this point. But then Descartes says, you know what, there are other beliefs I have, like beliefs about what's going on in mathematics, that seem absolutely certain and beyond doubt. And he says, I don't think I can raise a doubt about beliefs in mathematics by just conjecturing that, well, maybe I'm dreaming. Because even if I'm talking about a square that isn't real, that's in a dream, the square, says Descartes, has still got to have 4 equal sides. If I've got 2 apples and 3 apples sitting on a table in my dream, and those apples aren't real, it's still true that I've got 5 apples sitting on my table, that 2 plus 3 equals 5. So how does Descartes raise a doubt about such seemingly perfect knowledge and certain knowledge as the truths of mathematics? Well, we see the way he does it is by bringing in this imaginary creature, the evil genius or the evil demon. Now, he says it seems inconsistent with God's goodness that we would be deceived by such beliefs as the beliefs of mathematics. But as I said, the way you can kind of get a handle on what Descartes' talking about is to think about whether you ever screwed up on a problem on a math test, right? You were doing a problem that had several steps and you did not get the right answer, so you messed up somewhere along the way, and that's why you got it wrong. Well, imagine, see, Descartes knows that people can make mistakes and not get the right answer on a problem in mathematics. Remember, he's the inventor of analytic geometry, so he's no slouch as a mathematician. In fact, he's one of history's most famous mathematicians. But to get back to our slide, well, imagine there's some evil creature that has it in for you and that messes you up every time you're trying to do a proof in math. Well, this is kind of what Descartes is talking about by using this hypothesis of the evil genius or the evil demon to cast some doubt on the seemingly indubitable propositions in mathematics. He says, if God's not going to allow us to be deceived, and He's the source of goodness and truth, why couldn't I be deceived in my beliefs about mathematics by some malicious demon? And he says a powerful enough demon could make me doubt the knowledge I have from mathematics and other things, the reality of the sky, the air, the earth, and also abstract things that mathematics deals with, like shapes and sounds. And he says a malicious demon could even make me question whether I have a body at all. All may be doubted and can be set aside as if it were false. And so, as yet, Descartes has not reached the point that he's looking for. That is, of finding an absolutely certain truth on which he can rest everything. But he says, if I find it, it's going to be like the fixed point that Archimedes was looking for. If you took physics in high school, and I don't know, as a poly boy, we took a lot of science in high school, and everybody had to take physics. I don't know if that's the case anymore. But if you did, you learned that Archimedes was kind of the inventor of the lever and the fulcrum. Right? And Archimedes said, my lever is so good that in theory, if I had a long enough lever to get leverage, I could even lift the earth. Really, I should have this longer and this shorter. He says I could lift the earth itself, but what I need in order to do that is a fixed point to rest the lever on, symbolized here. And Archimedes claimed he could move the entire earth, but he needed a firm, immovable point. And if Descartes finds an absolutely certain truth, that's going to be like Archimedes' immovable point. It's going to be something he can rest the whole of knowledge and philosophy on. So Descartes longs to find then one certain unshakable truth on which to rest the whole of knowledge, philosophic and scientific knowledge, mathematical knowledge. So, does he find this truth? Well, he says, even if I'm dreaming and I've authored my own thoughts, still, I have to be here to be dreaming and imagine a world in my dreams. He says, even if I've convinced myself, even if I'm doubting everything I believe about what's going on around me, even if I've convinced myself that there's nothing in the world, no sky, no earth, no minds, no bodies, that it's all in a dream world, or it's all something that the evil genius is misleading me about, Descartes says, I have to exist to convince myself of this. And bring in the evil genius. The deceptive demon is unable to make Descartes doubt his own existence. Why? Well, Descartes says, even if a demon is constantly deceiving me, I have to be here to be deceived. So even if I'm being deceived about all this other stuff, whether I'm really in the room, whether there's really a world, whether there's earth, there's sky, whether I have a body, Descartes says, the one thing I can't be deceived about is I have to be here to be deceived. So, if I'm deceived about everything else, the one thing I can have confidence in is that I exist. I'm here to be deceived, says Descartes. So here is his Archimedean point. Here is his absolutely certain truth. It's his own existence, that he has to exist. Now, the way he expresses that, a proposition is a statement that can be true or false. The way he expresses it here in the Meditations is the proposition I exist is necessarily true every time I conceive it or think it, says Descartes. So this is his Archimedean point, the indubitable axiom on which he's going to base the whole of his philosophy. Now, I'm going to sketch out where he goes to do that, but we want to first look at some things Descartes says about the mind, because Descartes' groundbreaking work in philosophy, especially centered around his own thoughts about what we are as human beings and what the human mind is. And he pushed the envelope further on just what our mind is than anybody before him had done. Now, the way Descartes expresses his absolutely certain truth elsewhere in the Discourse on Method, which is a longer, more technical book, is as the famous cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am, therefore I exist. Usually, if nobody has heard about anything in philosophy, they've heard about Descartes' I think, therefore I am. And if somebody if you could continue circulating the roll, I think it's sitting on your desk, but I don't think it's going around. How many of you have heard of the I think, therefore I am before? How many have not? Well, some people. All right, so at least some people have. Well, look, before telling you how he goes from there and how we transition to British empiricism, want to look a little bit at how he thinks of matter and mind, material substance, what he calls body, and immaterial substance or mind. So he says, what is this I who necessarily exists? And he said, in other words, what are we essentially as human beings? Do we have an essential nature? I mean, in that debate last night, there was a political philosophy espoused by most of those candidates that undermines belief in us as individuals and our existence as individuals, and centers around, the social existence of human beings. But Descartes in a different tradition, a tradition that went on to emphasize our individual human rights, and that influenced people like John Locke, that influenced the founding fathers of our Constitution, as basically a document that limits government from infringing on our inalienable human rights. It's a very different view of politics and of who we are than the view that you would have heard from the candidates last night. As I said before, there's only one Democratic candidate that I support for president, and he was not at the debate last night, and that's Francis Underwood, the Kevin Spacey character in House of Cards. Anyway, not going to say more about that. But, so Descartes says, what am I essentially? And he says, you know what, I don't think the classical definition of man, of human being as a rational animal. Note, this is where Aristotle was, right? Aristotle says, what's the essential property of a human being? Well, we're reasoning beings. We're rational. That's what separates us apart from other animals and from the plants. We're reasoning beings, they're not. Descartes says, I don't think that's the best way to attack this problem. He says it's unclear what rational and animal mean. And he says this may raise more questions than it answers. So he's not going to go there. He says, well, when I thought about who I am, before I came to this detailed investigation, what was I thinking? He said, well, I believed I had a body, believed also that I had a soul and there were certain functions that it performed, like perceiving, thinking, initiating bodily movements, right, eating. But he says I gave little consideration to the essence of the mind or soul, other than to say, well, it's like a wind or fire or ether, right? When I was in high school, I became a ham radio operator at 14, and we can't go back to Athens, 2,500 years ago, and talk to people like Plato and Socrates at the beginning of philosophy. But the interesting thing was they had a coffee at a local ham radio store where these old-timers who was in their 70s and 80s, when I was, in the mid-1960s, they would show up, and they were there at the very beginning of radio, doing things like sending spark signals across the Atlantic, sending Morse code on very primitive equipment. And in the early days of radio, whether there was something called the luminous ether was a big debate scientifically. Descartes says it was like a wind or fire or ether. Why think there is such a medium if it's not perceivable. Well, think about a totally quiet pond, right? Or mud puddle, right? You know that if you throw a stone into it, you're going to get ripples. You're going to get waves that go out from where the stone went in the water. Well, how is it that you get any of those waves? If the pond dried up and you threw a rock in there, you wouldn't get any waves at all, right? You get the waves because there's a medium in which you have the waves, namely water in the pond. Well, the thought was if radio waves were waves, there must be some medium through which they travel, and so they postulated the luminous ether as an unseen medium through which things like radio waves travel. Now, for reasons that I don't even understand, Einstein's theories apparently set that hypothesis to rest for good. People said there is no such thing. But it was a big debate. So Descartes tries to think about what we are essentially as a human being, and he pushes the envelope farther than any philosopher had before him. And we're going to see what he does is he gets out a list of the properties of the soul or mind that makes it very different from the body. Now, in Descartes, and later in the British Empiricists, where we're going next, the word body is used ambiguously. You have to kind of look at the context to see how it's used. In other words, we saw Descartes when Descartes says, well, I could doubt whether I had hands and a body. Well, clearly from the context, he's talking about our human body. But body is also used as a mass term, as with a different meaning. That is, as a synonym for what we call material substance, for matter as opposed to mind. And he says, well, what are the properties of a material object, of matter? Now, I know this gets very technical, but what went on here influenced a lot of what went on in philosophy for the next 200 years. And the thing is, it made the theory of knowledge central, and who and what we are as a human being central to philosophy in a way that it had not been before. And what you think about who you are and whether you have any reliable knowledge extends to every other area of philosophy. That is, if we should be skeptical about whether we have any knowledge at all, then we should be skeptical about everything philosophy deals with, right? And so even though these guys get a little tedious, and it looks like they're examining the leaves on the trees, these tedious arguments had a tremendous influence in the way things have gone on, even down to our own day. So body, as a synonym for matter, has shape, right? Matter has form. It's located in space, right? This briefcase is somewhere. It happens to be sitting on a desk up in front of us. It occupies space to the exclusion of other bodies. You learn this in physics. He knows some Newtonian physics, Descartes. Can be perceived by the senses, whereas presumably the soul cannot, and is capable of motion in space. Now, these are the properties of a material thing, of matter for Descartes. And he says, but we already have talked about the fact that postulating about an evil genius and about whether or not we're dreaming has made even the existence of body doubtful. It's not certain that the body's attributes are part of what we are essentially as a human being. They may be fictitious, right? We could be brains in a vat, right? We could be in the Matrix. So he says this deceiver could cast doubt on the properties of the body. I'm not going to dwell on this because it gets off the track a little bit. But Descartes said, what is the property that's absolutely essential to me as a human being? And here is where he says the essential property of immaterial substance is thought. So he says, it's thought, I think, therefore I am, that's inseparable from my nature as a human being. If I should cease to think, that is to be aware of my surroundings, then I should cease to exist. So what does Descartes say he is essentially? Not so much a rational being as a thing that thinks, a thinking thing. So for Descartes, he's an individual soul. He's an individual soul that thinks. He's not essentially a social being, but essentially an individual being. Now, here's where Descartes pressed the envelope and influenced the later philosophers like the British empiricists. Descartes says, well, what do I mean by saying that I'm a thing that thinks? Basically, Descartes' view is that there are various processes that go on in our soul. He doesn't draw a clear distinction between our mind and our soul. Within our soul, within our minds, there are processes. This came to be called faculty psychology. And it was a predecessor of later psychology like Freud, etc. But he views the mind as like an immaterial quasi-machine in which immaterial mental processes take place, like doubting, understanding, affirming, denying, imagining something, perceiving something, in just the way that physical processes take place in our physical body, like circulation of blood and taking in oxygen and, respiration, stuff like that. So, in talking about the mind as a seat that has various capacities, Descartes pushes the envelope. Now, what about the existence of the soul? Now, here's the thing that Descartes is going to try to convince us of as a rationalist. He's going to try to convince us of the opposite of what we probably think. In other words, before we got corrupted by Descartes as a philosopher, right? In other words, in our ordinary everyday life, if somebody walked up to you on campus and said, by the way, what are you more sure of? That you have a body that really exists, or that you're an immaterial soul? Or that you have an immaterial soul? Well, most of us would say, well, I can at least perceive my body, right? He says the body's known by the senses. We have mental images of the body's parts and attributes. We can't get a mental image of ourself or our soul. David Hume later on gives this as a reason to be skeptical about its existence. But Descartes does not. So Descartes says, wouldn't it be odd? We've already said we can doubt whether or not we really have a body. He says, wouldn't it be odd if I had a more distinct grasp of something that's in doubt, of doubtfully existing body or matter, than a truly existing mind or soul? So what Descartes is going to try to convince us of is that we have more certain knowledge of ourselves as an immaterial mind or soul than even that we have knowledge of ourselves as a material body, or that we have knowledge of the material world around us. Descartes talks about a piece of wax. He's trying to say if we have real knowledge of the material world, it must be knowledge we got not from our senses, but from our reasoning abilities. So he's a rationalist in the same tradition with Plato on this. And how does he do this? Well, consider a piece of wax, say of yellow beeswax, the kind of wax that might be around in Descartes' day. You know, in a cold room, you thump it and it makes a sound. It's hard to the touch. It has a yellow color. It has weight. It has a perceived shape. But heat it up some so that it becomes pliable. It doesn't make a sound when you thump it anymore. It doesn't necessarily have the same shape. It doesn't have the same texture to your hands. It may have had a yellow color. Now maybe it's clear after you heat it, especially if you melt it entirely. And yet, we think that the wax that we heated, the heated piece of wax, is the same as that lump of wax that was cold. But Descartes says, why am I convinced that it's the same piece of wax? He says it can't be my senses that give me that knowledge. Why not? Well, he says all of the properties that the wax had before it was melted are now changed. In other words, all of the properties that my senses would tell me about to tell me it's the same piece of wax have changed. So he says it's reason and not the senses that tell us that the heated wax is the same wax. So the true nature of the wax, he says, is perceived more by the mind than by the senses. Now, this may seem an unusual way of talking about things, and it did to people in Descartes' day. Now, I have problems with this. Now, when you're a grad student, you're living on a shoestring, right? And you're a student. And when I was a grad student, sometimes I would give myself a little treat by making fudge from absolute scratch. I had a recipe for that. And I'm talking scratch. I'm talking like you're melting chocolate in a double boiler. So you take 2 1-inch, or 1 ounce squares of Baker's unsweetened chocolate. You put it in a double boiler. You got water in the first pot and you're melting it in the top pot so it doesn't burn. And you stand there and you watch those 2 1-ounce pieces of chocolate melt in that pot. Now Descartes is going to say, what makes you convinced, Vic, that puddle of chocolate that's now at the bottom of that double boiler is the same chocolate as what you put in as 2 squares? All of the properties have changed, right? It's not solid anymore. It's a puddle in the bottom, right? It doesn't feel, you wouldn't even want to touch it because it's hot. What convinces you? Descartes would say it's your mind, and not your senses. Your reason and not your senses. But if I say, wait a second, I was standing there watching it melt, Descartes. Buddy, my senses had something to do with convincing me that it's the same, chocolate. But Descartes uses this argument to say, it's by our reason that we know even the properties of a material thing more than our senses. That puts him in the rationalist camp. So he says the self is known better by the mind, by the reason, than by the senses. And he says an awareness of the self is truer and more certain than an awareness of a material thing like a piece of wax, or an awareness that we have a material body. Said mental activities confirming the existence of something like an external piece of wax also confirm our existence as a self. And I don't want to dwell on this, but if I say the wax exists because I see it, Descartes says, well, I have to be here as a perceiver. I must exist to see the wax. If I say the wax exists because I can touch it, I have to exist to have, feelings of touch, tactile sensations. If I say the wax exists because, here he doesn't mean imagine in the sense of think it up from nothing, but he means form a mental image of it when I perceive the wax. Well, I have to exist to form a mental image of the wax. So Descartes basically says if even a material thing is known not by the senses but in being understood by the intellect alone, the mind, then the mind is known even better this way because it's an immaterial thing. Now, this is what, by the way, caused the mind-body problem, that the properties of mind were very different. What I want to do is, in the next 5 minutes, is sketch out where Descartes has gone from here, because what is the only thing Descartes knows at this point in his philosophical journey? What's the only thing he knows for sure? Yeah, that he exists. In other words, he doesn't know that the material world exists, that other people exist, that God exists. In other words, they are something about which he still has to reason. How does he get back what he doubted? Because Descartes does not want to end up in skepticism like David Hume, who came after him. Descartes wants to give us reasons to have confidence in the beliefs that he doubted earlier. How does he get that confidence back? Well, in just a broad outline, here's what he does. He looks at the one truth he knows, the cogito. You can say, how can you build your whole philosophy on one truth? Well, he says, what were the marks of absolute necessary truth that the I think, therefore I am had? And he comes up with what Richard Rorty in the 20th century says is a visual metaphor. He says what marked out the proposition I think, therefore I am as necessarily true is that it had the properties of clarity and distinctness. And he says those are the properties of something that's necessarily true. And why is that a visual metaphor? Well, look at this projector, right? It's in focus, so things are clear, right? These letters are clear. But because they're clear, they're also distinct from one another. I can read the T as separate from the H and the I and the S, right? Now, you all have seen, whether it's in elementary school when your teacher was trying to get in focus a film strip or something, or maybe your own projector at home. You know that if you got this thing out of focus where things wouldn't be clear, the letters would bleed into one another. They wouldn't be distinct either. So Descartes uses this, and he says, now, the way Descartes gets himself out of skepticism and into confidence in the knowledge he doubted at the beginning is by taking a very roundabout way. If I asked you, if you were a person of strong faith, and you said, I believe in God, and I also believe that there's a table right here in front of us. If I said, well, what do you think you know for sure? Or what do you think you know more certainly? That God exists or that there's a table right in front of us? Well, most of us would say the latter. Even if we have strong faith in God, we might say, well, I believe God by faith, but I can see the doggone table and feel it and lift it, etc. Descartes goes the other way. What he does is he depends on the claim that he has innate knowledge, innate ideas. And he says, do I have any other innate ideas that have the same marks of clarity and distinctness that the I think, therefore I am, that the cogito had? And lo and behold, he finds his innate idea of God. And we looked at the ontological argument already that Descartes uses. And I said, at the point that he uses it, he's doubting everything, so he can't use something like the design argument that depends on observations about the world, because at this point, he doesn't know if he can defend philosophically the existence of the world. So he says, I have this clear and distinct idea of God. And so he proves God's existence using the ontological argument and one or two lesser known a priori arguments, right? Now, if God exists and is no deceiver, Descartes basically says, wait a second, if God made me such that I think there's a real table here, but there wasn't, either I'm dreaming or he allows me to be deceived by the evil genius, then wouldn't God in some sense be a deceiver? If he's made me such that I think there's a real table here and there isn't. But Descartes says, from the properties of God, God is morally perfect, he can't be a deceiver. So when I think there's a real material table here, I must be right. So Descartes gets us back out of skepticism, back to confidence in the beliefs we had before by taking this circuitous route of first proving God's existence, then the existence of the material world and other people and everything else. But it depends on his belief that we have innate knowledge, innate ideas. We're going to see that that's the first thing that John Locke and the empiricists reject. When we come into this world, says John Locke, that's what our minds are like. These blank tablets, these blackboards. We don't have any knowledge. So they basically cannot take Descartes' way out of skepticism. But now you can say, well, what has Descartes done? This is the last thing I'm going to say. You say, we're back where we started. We're back saying now we can believe the things that we doubted. Right, that we're in a real material world with other people, that God exists. What has changed? Well, for Descartes, what has changed is we can now deduce these things philosophically, from the cogito. In other words, that he's given us rational reasons to back up the common sense, unreflected beliefs we have about the reality of the external world, the reliability of our senses, the existence of God, etc. So something has changed, that we now have, proofs, like a proof in geometry of these beliefs. Now, we'll see that the British empiricists end in skepticism because they can't take Descartes' way out for one thing. Okay, we're going to look at video to begin, next week's class. Again, I'm in the office if somebody wants to discuss things. I'm not going to be there long today, but next week you can stop by or make an appointment. Usually between 12 and 1. So have a good day. Again, I got in the grades on time. If you haven't checked them out, they're in Eagle Links.